The idea that robots would walk among us has long been the domain of science fiction. And while that is now possible, it's still early days in the physical form. In the digital world, however, human-to-bot interactions are advancing at hyperspeed. And in the emerging Metaverse, the game changes completely. As humans take on avatar personas, what distinguishes us from other computer-generated characters? Virtual influencers take their human Instagram equivalents to a whole new level. To explain how and why, we're joined by TAMA Lever, Professor of Internet Studies at Perth's Curtin University. TAMA, welcome to the show.
Good to be here.
Let's start with your definition of a virtual influencer.
So a virtual influencer is basically someone who goes through the process and looks like and feels like an influencer. So someone who connects via social media and has a meaningful following who value that interaction, but does not exist as a physical entity. So they're not a real person. They're usually either an animated character or an amalgam of different virtual technologies who interacts with an audience like a full-blown influencer would and has a following that value and treasure their insight and perspective.
And this is something that we've seen really spike in recent months.
Absolutely. So virtual influencers have been emerging over the last few years. I think Lil Miquela is probably the most famous example, and I think she's got a following of upward of 3 million now. But what we are seeing is the technology is maturing and the people are realizing that having an influencer that they completely control in every aspect is in many ways more desirable as many celebrities go off the rails in different ways. We've got, much more tame when they're virtual influencers.
I guess it's a lot easier to manage, isn't it?
Well, that's right. And they can work for anyone at any time as long as you've got the right software.
Facebook, now Meta, has clearly banked its future in the Metaverse. Juggernauts like that don't usually get bets like this wrong. Is the Metaverse the future, in your opinion, of consumer digital commerce?
Look, I think Mark Zuckerberg is trying really hard to convince the world that it is. I think the idea of a fully realized 3D immersive environment like a Metaverse is something that a lot of companies are working towards. And obviously Facebook, having rebranded as Meta, are betting the farm on this. So we'll definitely have a Metaverse and we'll definitely have experiences in it. Whether it lives up to people's imagining, I think is probably going to be the real challenge, because we've seen Metaverses in films like Ready Player One, which are amazing, realistic, interactive, immersive environments. And I think that what we've got so far, which is sort of people in headsets who look like they've just walked out of sort of a 1980s game, there's definitely some terrain to improve on before we get to something that everyone wants to use. But at the same time, we do see lots of companies. It's not just social media companies. We also see, for example, special effects companies being bought up by gaming companies who are probably walking in the same direction and are going to arrive at a slightly different looking metaverse, but actually it might be a richer and more immersive experience if you're using gaming and cinematic technologies rather than social media as your starting point.
Well, this is a whole new world. Like most things online, this is unregulated. What are the red flags with virtual influencers penetrating our virtual lives?
Oh, look, I think virtual influencers, the challenge there is whether they are regulated as entities, like as people would be, or are they regulated as, say, software? But either way, when they're interacting with people and those interactions feel real, those questions of disclosure of, should most influencers have to disclose if they're being paid to spruik a product, for example. Most virtual influencers are a product. So do they have to reveal that they're spruiking something when it's a third party? To what extent do we need to be transparent about the money that's changing hands, behind closed doors? And to what extent do we need to value those relationships that are built between virtual influencers and their audiences? Even if we know to some extent that they're artificial entities, people have real senses of connection with these entities. Equally, do people have to disclose when they are virtual influencers? For a long time, the intrigue around some of the first generation of virtual influencers was nobody was quite sure if they were real or not. So is that something we have to disclose? If you're a bot, should you have to say that in your bio, for example? So there are some real transparency and commerce sort of rules that just haven't formed yet around these sort of relatively new entities. And I think those are the sort of rules that will need to fall into place pretty quickly as virtual influencers become more commonplace and indeed inhabit something like the metaverse.
Meta says its specific areas of concern are representation and cultural appropriation. Tell us about Pseudogram and therefore why this is fraught before we even get started.
Yeah, so Pseudo is a virtual influencer or virtual model who was created by a white British man called Cameron Wilson, who then created a very dark-skinned, I guess you would say, presenting as if sort of Nigerian virtual influencer. He didn't disclose that to start with, and so Pseudo sort of built up a following. And then as it was revealed that Pseudo was essentially a software artifact created by Cameron Wilson, he really didn't take very well the idea that there were some questions about, a black virtual influencer being essentially controlled by a white man, and whether that was actually knocking out opportunities for real models and other people in these spaces. And I think that conversation really highlights, questions of representation and appropriation need to be asked right now, because otherwise representation might be what we've got. So some dark-skinned models on our catalog. Oh, but there's no actual, when nobody's being paid, it's just software. And I think that's a really challenging and problematic direction that this could go. And it's good that those questions are being asked now.
And what's the way forward with this? Where might we be in a decade's time when it comes to virtual influencers?
Oh, look, in a decade's time, we can see that the software will be so good that if you don't tell us, we're going to spend a lot of time guessing whether we're interacting with a real person or a piece of technology. And I think before we get to that, we have to have some rules, some clear guidelines about disclosing that sort of information. Otherwise, it's going to get very confusing. In the same way that we've seen deep fakes, for example, used around the Ukraine war, I think that's the beginning. And disinformation is already ripe on the internet. The idea that we're going to see photorealistic speaking entities and we can't tell whether they're real or not, the only way that's not going to be an enormous problem is if we get the rules and the boundaries right today before the software gets as good as it will.
So maybe our next interview will be done by a virtual influencer rather than myself. That's potential something in the future.
How do I even know you're real? That's my challenge today.
I really enjoyed the conversation. Thank you very much to TAMA Lever. He's with us there talking all about virtual influencers. He's Professor of Internet Studies at Perth's Curtin University. Thank you very much.
It's been my pleasure.